In this video, you will learn everything to do with Excel's pivot tables. We'll start with a brief explanation of pivot tables and their benefits. After that, we'll go step by step, showing you how to prepare your data, build your first pivot table, format it nicely, and create charts and slicers to help you interpret your data. Let's get started. What are pivot tables? Simply put, pivot tables are the best way to summarize data in Excel. They automatically organize your raw data into clear tables that show totals, trends, and comparisons, all without you writing formulas. In other words, a pivot table can turn a messy sheet of sales records into a neat report in seconds, with little to no advanced knowledge of Excel. Note that I'll be demonstrating this on the web-based version of Excel, so if you're using the desktop app, tools may be in slightly different locations. All right, let's get started. Preparing your data. We need data before we can build a pivot table, and that data must be clean. In other words, it needs to be in columns with headers, for example, date, salesperson, region, product, and sales amounts, with no blank errors or merged cells. Rather than walking you through basic data formatting step by step, there's a workbook you can download in the description that we'll use for this video. Once you have that open, I'll give you a quick rundown instead. All right, our simple data set has 5 columns: the date of sale, the salesperson, the region, the product sold, and the sale amount. Everything appears to be formatted correctly, except for the sale amount column. Rather than having raw numbers, let's give them value. Highlight column E from top to bottom, and on the Home tab in the middle of the screen, you should see a setting called General with a drop-down menu arrow to its right. Click it and select Currency. That's it. While we could jump in and make this into a pivot table, let's take one more step just to be safe. Let's turn it into an official Excel table first. That way, we won't run into any strange formatting issues down the line. Why a table and how you can insert one. Why use a table? Well, it's pretty simple. Tables grow automatically. If you add a new row of data, the table expands to include it, making it easier to refresh the data in your pivot table. In other words, transforming your data into a table now saves you from having to manually adjust your data ranges every time you add new data. Luckily, transforming raw data into a table is easy. Simply select any cell in your data set, then go to Insert Table, and make sure My Table Has Headers is checked. Click OK. There you go. This table will be named Table 1 by default, so let's rename it. Make sure you're selecting a cell in the table. Open the Table Design tab at the top of your screen, select the name box on the left side of your screen, and rename it Sales Data. Hit Enter on your keyboard to save the change. Now, let's make the pivot table itself. Insert a pivot table. Click any cell inside your table. Then go to Insert, and then Pivot Table. A pane appears on the right side of your screen. It'll ask what data you want to display and where you want to place the pivot table. You'll also have the option to create your own. In the future, I strongly recommend making the most of Excel's recommendations. The recommended pivot tables are a great way to quickly draw conclusions from your data. For example, sales amount by salesperson will quickly identify who my best and worst salespeople are. For this video, however, we will choose Create Your Own Pivot Table as a learning exercise. Click plus New Sheet as a destination, and it'll open a new clean sheet. Keeping one pivot table on a sheet is a great way to keep everything organized and prevent any freezing or lagging with large data sets. Okay, our new worksheet has an empty pivot table with a placeholder icon. The pivot table fields pane on the right is where the magic happens. Now, we'll pick which fields, columns from our data to include. Explore pivot table fields. The pivot table fields pane lists all the columns fields from your source table. It also has 4 boxes at the bottom where you arrange those fields: filters, columns, rows, and values. These areas instruct Excel on how to construct the pivot table and what to include in a summary. Let's look at each of them. Filters. The fields you add here act as the main filters for your pivot table. Adjusting these filters allows you to sort and display data of your choosing. Rows. Fields here become the row labels along the left side. Each unique value in a row field gets its own row in the report. Columns. The fields here appear as columns headers at the top of the pivot table. Values. Fields placed here are the summarized numeric values that fill the pivot tables. Think of it like this. Columns and rows give your table structure. Values are your individual data points. and filters are how you can sort and parse your data. Got it? All right, let's apply this by creating a simple summary. Analyze data with rows, columns, and values. To begin, we want to find the total number of sales per salesperson. In the PivotTable Fields pane, select the salesperson box. Excel will automatically place it in the rows area. Now there's a list of each salesperson down the left side of the pivot table. Next, check sales amount. That is placed in the values area by default since it's numeric data. Now you have one row per salesperson and a new column showing the sum of sales amounts, the total sales for each person and for the company as a whole. You can now easily plug and play with different variables. For example, go ahead and check both region and product in the pivot table fields. And now you'll have an easy way to see exactly what each person sold. If you only want to view the total sales amount per region, simply uncheck the boxes for salesperson and products. As you can see, West seems to be the best region. You can also drag and drop variables in different spots. Let's recheck the boxes next to salesperson and products. Now, I'll drag product from the rows field to the columns field in the pane. As you can see, that completely reorders the table. Now we can see which products were the big money makers. The options with pivot tables are limitless by design, so don't be afraid to experiment with different combinations. Excel does all the math and grouping for you. Who knows what trends or patterns you will uncover? Still, there are times you want to find out something specific rather than going fishing around in the dark. That's where filters comes in. Use filters for targeted analysis. For example, suppose you want to view only the sales of laptops. Well, you can. In the field list, drag product into the filters box. Now, at the top of your pivot table, there's a product filter. Click the drop-down menu, uncheck the box next to everything except laptop, and click apply. The dataset has been significantly reduced, and we now only see the number of laptops sold per region. Critically, this does not alter the underlying data at all. It simply instructs the pivot table which rows to include and exclude. To clear the filter and view all products again, click the filters drop down, click select all, and hit enter. Now, the pivot table is displaying all the products sold. We can also remove this filter at any time by simply dragging product back to the rows field. You can also customize how the pivot table summarizes data for you by combining and adjusting calculations. Let's play around with it. Summarize values. By default, the numeric values in the values field are added together. Instead of finding the sum, you can instruct the pivot table to count, find an average, or calculate a percent. In the values field of the pivot table fields, click on sum of sales amounts and select value field settings at the bottom. Here, we have numerous options, including sum, count, average, max, min, and more. For example, select counts and press OK. Now we can see the total number of sales made at each location on a per product basis. Now, a word of warning. The automatic naming Excel does for this column can be messy. For example, it now says count of sales amounts. Don't worry, you can rename it. I'll switch it to total sales. Now let's do something a bit more advanced. I'll reset the pivot table so region, salesperson, and product are in rows and the sum of sales amounts is in values. Now, what if I wanted to see the percentage each product makes of total sales? Well, we can do that. First, let's remove the salesperson and region from the pivot table. So uncheck the boxes next to them. Move product up into rows. Open the drop-down menu next to sum of sales amounts. Open value field settings. Select show values as. Open the drop-down menu where it says no calculation. Choose percent of grand total and click OK. So, what's this data telling us? Right now, it's telling us that laptops account for 68.71% of our total sales amounts. In other words, 68.7% of the money we made was from laptop sales. That's helpful, but not what we were aiming for. Remember, we want to see what percent of our total sales were laptops, not what percent of the money we made. Open sum of sales amounts again, select value field settings, switch it to count numbers, and hit enter. All right, now the field is named count of sales amounts, which means Excel is telling us the percentage of the total number of sales each product accounts for. Lastly, change the name to percentage of total sales. All right, now let's reset the pivot table back to the way it was. Recheck the boxes next to salesperson and region, and make sure product, region, and salesperson are in rows. Open the value field, switch back over to sum in the first tab, open the second, and select no calculation before hitting OK. Lastly, go ahead and add the $ and decimals back to the values by highlighting the entire column and selecting currency. Alright, now we're back at square one, so we can talk a bit more about pivot table formatting and design. Formatting and design options. As we've seen, pivot tables can become very messy very quickly if you frequently change your settings. So let's see how to clean up a pivot table. Make sure you're selected on a cell in the pivot table, and on the ribbon at the top, click Pivot Table. Here you'll find many pivot table styles in a small gallery. These change colors and borders. Hover over each style to see a preview on your table and click to apply one you like. I'll go with the light orange one. Open Style Options. Here, you can enable banded rows to shade every other row, making it easier to scan. You can also apply this to columns, but I personally don't recommend it. If anything, it makes visibility worse. Number formatting is important too. You've already seen how to do this on the Home tab, but it's something you'll always want to double check. Technically, once you apply a format to a column, it should remain. But Excel, like any program, is funny. Sometimes the formatting gets reset, so be sure to pay attention. Alright, now you've seen how to make your pivot table look sleek and professional. Sometimes, though, you need more. That's what we'll cover in the next section. Create pivot charts and slicers. Numbers in a table are great, but visuals can make data really stand out. That's where pivot charts come in. As the name suggests, they are linked charts that reflect the data in your pivot table. To create one, click inside the pivot table and then open the Insert tab. Click Recommended Charts. We only have 3 charts to choose from, so I'll opt for the final option: Sales Amount by Product, Region, and Salesperson. Click plus Insert Pivot Chart. Excel will insert a chart that automatically uses the fields from the pivot table. Now, as you can see, the chart is an absolute mess. That's because our pivot table has too much data for the chart to display. Let's pull the pivot table fields pane back up by clicking on a cell in the table, selecting Pivot Table in the ribbon, and opening Field List. Now, uncheck the boxes next to Salesperson and Product. Now, we get a quick breakdown of the sales by region. Pretty good. As you noticed, a pivot chart updates in real time along with the pivot table. To some degree, you can also edit a pivot chart like a regular chart. Close the Pivot Table Fields pane, then double-click the chart. You can now edit the title, legends, and the vertical and horizontal axes. You cannot, however, edit the data being displayed. That's because the chart and table are inextricably linked. A change in one will be automatically reflected in the other. If you want to build a chart that you can edit independently of a pivot table, you can, but you'd need to start with a regular chart instead. Now, before I wrap up this video, I want to briefly introduce you to another way to sort and filter your data: slicers. Slicers are visual filter buttons that work like on-screen checkboxes. To showcase this, I'll remove the pivot chart and reset the data to its original state. To add a slicer, go to PivotTables, then Insert Slicers. Select a field. I'll choose Region and click OK. Excel will add a box with buttons for each region. Clicking a region, for example, Central, will immediately filter the pivot table, displaying only that region. If you want to view 2 regions, Central and West, you can do so by holding the Control key and clicking the West button with your mouse. You can also click the filter icon with a little red X in the corner to wipe any existing filter. Alright, in this video, you've learned how to prepare data in Excel, transform it into a table, insert a pivot table, add, remove, and format fields, and even make charts that update with your pivot table in real time. Thank you so much for watching, and I will see you in the next one.